couple years ago, best-selling author and imaging specialist Andy Saunders blew our minds with the incredible Apollo Remastered. In that book, Andy went back to the original negatives from the Apollo missions and just brought them back to incredible life after years in the freezer. His follow-up, Gemini and Mercury Remastered, does the same thing for the incredible Project Gemini, and to a lesser extent the Mercury missions, as they didn't have as much room around to take so many photos. But in Gemini and Mercury Remastered, Andy has worked his magic yet again, blowing my mind with that fabulous cover image of Ed White, which we will go into some detail this week on The Aviation Show, brought to you as always by the fabulous Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona. And we're going to get into the nitty gritty because we're sticking around in Arizona quite a bit, because it was Arizona State University that digitized the original negatives that had come out of the freezer at NASA. And Andy takes us through exactly what he had to do to produce quite a remarkable book. And I do go on about the Ed White photo quite a bit. So be sure to like and subscribe. We've got lots on Gemini at the moment because it is the 60th anniversary of that program, including, if you're watching this right now, Gemini 7, that spent 2 weeks in space in a teeny tiny capsule. But let's start getting to the photos and talk to Andy Saunders about how he brought Gemini and Mercury back to life. Andy, thank you so much. It's lovely to meet you at last. I've been poring over your books for the last couple of years now. Thank you for them. They're a delight.
They were a joy to work on. There were a lot of work. Apollo was kind of 10,000 hours of processing and then a lot of research. Gemini, Mercury, the new book, bit less in terms of processing, but more on the research. So it's been kind of 6 or 7 years of work. However, it's a privilege to work on this subject matter, something I'm fascinated in. So it's hard to really call it work. So if people then appreciate it as well, that's great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure. We just couldn't connect for Apollo because you were a super busy man. And thank you for making the time for the project that I actually find the most fascinating in Gemini. But we're going to get onto that in a minute. I suppose the question is, how did this come about? How did you get involved in going back to these negatives and bringing the photos back to life?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, this is the prequel. So it really started with the first book, Apollo Remastered. And that really started when I produced an image of Neil Armstrong. I actually produced it back in about 2010, but waited for the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 to release it, so 2019. And then I started to work on the imagery kind of full time, if you like. But really, this goes all the way back to childhood, I guess. I've always had an obsession with the Apollo landings, early human space exploration, the bravery, the pioneering era. Always had a fascination, always had a passion for photography. But yet it was producing that image, being frustrated. I wanted to see Neil Armstrong on the moon and I couldn't. I mean, one of the most, if not the most important moments in human history. I wanted to see him on the moon, but for those that know, we only took one camera. He held it for almost all of the EVA. So the photographs we see are actually of Buzz Aldrin. So that's when I decided to apply this quite unusual processing technique to the other source of film. That was this 16mm movie film called the DAC camera, a bit like an old cinefilm style camera. And we may well talk about that technique later, but it's this quite unusual technique on that film to produce that image that I always felt was missing from the history books. And when I produced it, when I was working on it, I didn't really know what to expect. When I started, it was filmed from the lunar module window, and it was so clear as I was working on it. It was like I'd gone back to 1969 and I was standing in that window watching one of the most important moments in history unfold before my eyes. I thought, no one's ever seen it like this before, other than Buzz Aldrin, who was waiting to get out and was up behind the camera. And I just got hooked on this process. I thought I want to do more of this. So the time was quite fortuitous because NASA and Arizona State University had just finished this project of getting all of the original film. This is the holy grail of film, the film that was actually in the cameras during these missions, out of this frozen vault in Houston, digitally scanned it, put the film back. So everything we've seen since have been based on duplicate film or copies of duplicate film, or back in an analog world, you'd have an internegative of a copy of a copy. So there's multiple generations before we'd see the image. and there's a degradation in quality at every generation. So to then have this repository of 35,000 pieces of film digitally scanned of the original film for the first time to work on, I started to work on some of it, and I thought, this is applying some time and some effort to this analog film, but these originals, they hold so much information. We can now see this era as never before. And that's when I decided to take on the Apollo project. That was the first book, Apollo Remastered. This, of course, we're talking about the prequel. So this takes us right back to the very dawn of human space exploration. And, the missions are so important, not just in terms of spaceflight history, but in human history. Since the year dot, civilizations have looked up and dreamt of being able to voyage towards the stars. And this golden era in the 60s is when that ancient dream finally became a reality. So the really important missions, and that was clearly something that I wanted to tackle next.
Because the new book, Gemini or Gemini, depending on how you want to, all got Gemini, and Mercury Remastered, this is really the birth of space photography, really, isn't it? And it starts from an interesting place in that on the first few Mercury flights, it's very Heath Robinson, isn't it? There's not a lot of room in the capsule. There's not, they can't worry about weight. So how did the photography element come into those early Mercury flights?
Yeah, NASA weren't keen for the astronauts to actually take a camera on board. Like you say, these were groundbreaking missions, very short missions, tiny capsules. They didn't want the astronauts to be the focus to be taken away working on with a camera. They were focusing on mission critical, staying alive. To be quite frank, I mean, Shepard's
flying the thing
to leave Earth, and it was only 15 minutes sub orbital hop, and so. On Shepard's flight, it was a camera that was mounted in the window that took photographs automatically every 6 seconds. Then when we got to John Glenn was the first American to go into orbit, but he said, no, I want to take a camera. People are going to want to know what it's like to be an astronaut. I'm going to see things no human's ever seen before. I want to take a camera. And he actually bought his own. So he went for a haircut during training, spotted this camera in the window of a drugstore, bought it for $40 and said, I want to take this on my mission. NASA relented. They put a pistol grip on it to help him use it. And with it, he took the first still photographs of Earth from space. So it was often it was the astronauts that kind of drove the desire to take cameras and better cameras, particularly on the early missions. Alexei Leonov for the Soviets, he strapped a pad to his arm and some coloured pencils, and he sketched, for example, orbital sunrise and sunset. Glenn took his camera. Wally Schirra took the first Hasselblad on his Mercury mission. So remember, these Mercury 7 astronauts were the rock stars of the day. They were mixing with all the best photographers, Life magazine, National Geographic, and he sought their advice. They suggested a Hasselblad 500C, as it was, medium format, interchangeable lenses and magazines. So, you could take different types of photographs. It had that flexibility, medium format. And so that was adapted, and he took the first Hasselblad. And that relationship then, they experimented with other cameras throughout Project Gemini, which was a space camera. That was a medium format camera, but they really settled on the Hasselblads that were then used through of course, took to the moon and even into the shuttle era.
So when we say medium format, what do we mean?
Just a larger film. So I think most people that remember film cameras will remember a 35mm film. That's what John Glenn took, for example. Medium format is 70mm. It's almost like having a bigger sensor on a digital camera, more megapixels, I guess, is an equivalent. So you can capture more information on that film.
70mm, the only way to go in cinema and photography.
There you go. Yeah.
It's an interesting mix. The thing I loved going through both your books, especially the new one, is in your brain, because of say Moonrise and things like that, the Hasselblad is sort of this iconic space camera, but it's such a mix of different cameras, isn't it? Was there any sort of trial and error with this, or did they just fall into getting to that sort of?
It's kind of an iterative, organic process, yeah. But like I say, the astronauts often drove the handheld cameras, and the photographs from NASA's point of view, they're purely for technical assessment. John Glenn, to some extent, broke that, I guess, because he wanted to just show people back home what it was like. But he also took a more specialist camera because they realised we could take low light photography. What's it like to take star fields and things in space. So there was a lot of photographs taken for scientific reasons, even on the early missions. Certainly throughout Gemini, when the first photographs came back, and we realised the kind of things that you could do with space photography, such as mapping, improved mapping, meteorological studies, topographical studies, oceanography, looking for Earth resources. The military were interested, so NASA started to get requests from the Weather Bureau, from the military, from MIT to take these more science-based photographs. So, but they were always about technical assessment or scientific reasons. So Gemini had more things to take photographs of, including things outside the spacecraft, such as when they were doing the rendezvous or docking, because Gemini had to prove all these key concepts needed to reach for the moon with Apollo. So, like I say, docking, spacewalks, EVA, so they had more things to photograph. So that's when they were part of the reason they started to experiment with better cameras and different cameras. So it was really, an organic process. Mercury was pretty raw. It was basic 35mm cameras other than shearers. But the quality of the images out of the capsule on Mercury, you'll notice in the book, aren't that great until perhaps Gordon Cooper's photographs. He took some absolutely stunning shots of Earth, but the windows weren't ideal. There was, like I say, small capsules, short missions. Gemini, after Gemini 4, NASA started to appreciate space photography more because there were absolutely stunning shots of Ed White during his spacewalk. They really captured the public's imagination, and NASA realized, we can get continued congressional support, public support for more funding with space imagery. So that's when training got better. They looked at more, like I say, different types of cameras, but really the Hasselblad was always there, really, throughout Gemini. They tried a Hasselblad super wide camera, and I just wish that made it to the moon. I mean, anyone that's seen Apollo Remastered book, if you look at the Apollo 9 photographs, there's something about them. They used the super wide. That was in the Apollo mission. They used the super wide on. The latter few Gemini missions, you'll notice, they're just incredible. Hasselblad super wide. They also, like I say, used this Mora space camera that had some reliability issues. So ultimately, they settled on the Hasselblads. In terms of 16mm film, so in Mercury, they had what they called a pilot observer camera. So there's a 16mm film in the instrument console, filming the astronaut through the mission.
So that's where we see all those classic pictures of Scott Shepherd and everybody like looking back with the little mirror on their chest.
So that's where I've been able to use this stacking process so we can now effectively climb on board and see them in this incredible clarity, almost to the pores in their skin, during these historic missions, Alan Shepard, John Glenn. That's like this pilot observer camera. They had an instrument observer camera as well. They eventually did away with that because they had the mirror, and they realized actually we can see what's going on with the instrument console and the astronauts' interaction with it with one camera. And of course, weight is such a limited and important resource on spaceflight. So we could lose that camera, and then they actually replaced that with the first ever microgravity experiment, for example. So that was the 16mm cameras. And then through Gemini, they used, it was a bit like a DAC camera that eventually went to the moon. So they could use that handheld.
So is Buzz's selfie when he's on the EVA, is that the super wide? I'm testing your memory now, because that is a great picture.
As is what you could argue was actually the first selfie, but it was inside the spacecraft, Michael Collins. So he utilized the wide angle capability as well to take a selfie in space before selfies were even a thing.
I know. Yeah, who'd have thought the 60s invented everything cool and everything not so cool? Which, there we go. Let's get into sort of the nitty gritty of what you've gone into. You said that ASU had sort of brought all these things out of the freezer. What was the state of the film at the start of the process? Because you mentioned in the book this stuff hadn't been touched for decades. So when they started to defrost it, what was the state of the originals?
The Gemini film was actually in a pretty good state. So that clearly, like I say, the originals, the photographs or the film is just so important, so valuable, delicate. You just don't want to handle it multiple times. And they obviously realized that during the Gemini program. And so, like I say, the originals, they made a master duplicate set, and the originals were clearly aged well, and therefore almost certainly went straight into the freezer where to maintain the quality, where they've stayed ever since. When you go a bit further back with Mercury, evidently they didn't go straight into a freezer. They have aged quite badly. They were quite badly handled. There's a lot of tears in them that have been just replaced with a piece of sticky tape, for example. So even worse than that, I mean, Alan Shepard's flight. So again, if we think first American in space, the second human to leave Earth and voyage into the unknown. And there's this camera took photographs every 6 seconds throughout that flight. The mission got back, and on the original film, so not on a duplicate set, every single frame of original film was scribbled over with felt pen. Which is just, I mean, you saw that sacrilege. How it seems unthinkable now, but we do have to remember, the political climate at that time, what this flight was about. The US were trying to catch up with the Soviets. They were in a race. Gagarin had been into orbit. Shepard was just doing a suborbital hop. Let's get him up, get him back, get the next mission. They were taken, like say, for technical assessment. They weren't taken for their aesthetic quality. They weren't taken for posterity. They were taken, so these were the frame numbers, and there was a scribbled on every frame. So the Mercury film took a lot more in terms of the restoration, because historical preservation just wasn't high up on the agenda during Project Mercury. With Gemini, like I say, the film has aged well. It's in a pretty good condition. However, they do still need a lot of digital processing to get the best out of them, because it is still ultimately, if you think of a scan, it's effectively like taking a digital photograph of a piece of analog film. So those of your viewers that remember film negatives, they're not negatives. The colour is actually like a colour positive reversal film. But those that remember like the negatives, they're very dark. They weren't designed to be digitally scanned. You should shine light through them. So they do still, they look flat and dull and lifeless, which is just, a tragedy given what they contain, as has a lot of the imagery that we've seen since that have been based on duplicate film and badly scanned. So to go back to the originals, apply this time and effort and digital processing to them, they do hold the information. They hold an incredible amount of visual information that we can now pull out by applying digital processing techniques.
Well, let's talk about some of those processing. What do you do to these images? Because I think I'm jump to this. My favorite image that you've brought back to life is the Ed White image. I'm fascinated by Ed White and his brother, who was desperate to be an astronaut as well and was killed in an F-105 in Vietnam. Ed, of course, dies Apollo 1. But that shot of him after the EVA that you've just brought back from what looks like just a blank shot. That wonderful thing of those of us of age that have taken a picture that we think is going to be great and you get it, there's nothing there. That image of him looking exhausted but elated, and it's on the cover of the UK book, is incredible. How, I think, is the only question to ask. How do you go about finding that data in a negative that doesn't look like there's anything there?
Yeah, part of the process of going through these, a lot of them look, you can see what's in them. Some they may have been underexposed when they were taken and the lighting conditions weren't perfect. And again, as I say, we're looking at effectively a digital picture of a piece of film. So the film itself is they tend to look quite underexposed. And so, that was almost a black frame, but you can just tell that, could see the window. And if you see the window and where it is, we may well see a person. So I would always look at images like that, similar to the cover of Apollo Remastered. That was just a black frame, but I could see a window that turned out to be the reflection of a window off Jim McDivitt's helmet. And there's this wonderful portrait of him undertaking the first ever docking in space between two crewed spacecraft. So it was really worth looking more into images like that, just like this one of Ed White. It's actually a panorama of two. So to get that full portrait, I used two photographs. And you can, like I say, although they look like there's not a lot in them, the visual information is captured in these scans. These are high bit depth scans. So what looks, if you look at, for example, towards the very dark end of that spectrum, with the human eye, you can barely see small differences, but with digital processing, we can basically stretch that contrast. And so you start to see the image. Now, when you push the processing that hard, it doesn't look, but you can see there's something amazing in it. Oh my God, there's Ed White. This is going to be, and the lighting is amazing. This is going to be a stunning shot, but it looks awful. So that's what takes the time to balance the frame, to get the colors right, to reduce the noise, to to end up with an image that's like that on the cover. And yeah, I love it. It's just so atmospheric. You can tell it's kind of 60s, where it's deeply personal. It's like we're sitting in the spacecraft alongside, looking at this man who's just done something extraordinary, the second human to step out of a spacecraft into the void of space. And it looks like he's almost looking out into the heavens through the window. We can see that star map over the window. And of course, as you say, he was later killed in the Apollo 1 fire. I was really grateful to his son and his daughter to give me the blessing to put that on the cover of the book, because it is quite a very poignant shot.
Oh, it's absolutely wonderful. And Ed, because of that spacewalk, I think has always been my favorite of the Gemini guys, because as we spoke to Jeff last week on his book, and of course he's got that wonderful line where Ed, probably minutes before that picture's taken, said it's the saddest moment of his life, having to come back inside.
Yeah. It was also very risky. I mean, what's incredible. So, but of course, the book is, you could argue, is mostly about the photographs. But what I always want to do is tell the stories of each mission via the captions. So, reading the mission transcripts of what went on is just, you start to realize the risks that were taken. So, on that mission, for example, Jim McDivitt, Ed White floats out of view, and Jim McDivitt says, well, where are you, Ed? I can't see you. He said, I'm back near the adapter section. Oh, actually, I'm near the thrusters, so don't thrust. And you think, hang on a minute, was that the health and safety level back in the day? It's not a very good critical control measure, is it, to say, actually, could you not thrust right now, because it'll burn my suit and I'll die. So reading the transcripts, and I've got a lot of this information alongside the images to tell these stories. I think people reading it will be amazed just at the level of risk that was taken. But yeah, that shot is him back inside. So they struggled to close the hatch, actually, really struggled to close the hatch. And also, again, in the transcripts, much later in the mission, they're recounting this when they're out of contact with the ground, but it's still recorded on tape. And they're laughing about it, we couldn't close it. And I was like leaning on you and we're going, heave, trying to close this hatch. But actually, so they made light of it, but it was just so raw, these missions, so risky. And that's one of the things I love about them.
The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection, like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777 and the second prototype 787 Dreamliner. Whether you're a military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the Aviation Show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its third year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better, because the Philippine Mars is now on display, and right across the car park, the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum's doors are wide open to welcome you in to check out an amazing collection of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and other vehicles, if you get fed up with all the airplanes. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing. That's something we need to talk about, is the text that you've added to the book. You overview each of the missions before we go into the photos, and then below them you have, as you're saying, elements of the transcript explaining what the image is. You said you sort of went back to the mission transcripts. How do you choose the right elements for that? Because that's narrative, that's you being a historian, that's pulling all of these different threads together to bring an image which, in a lot of cases, is utterly ethereal, especially the pictures of the Earth that they took on some of the later missions. How do you then encapsulate it? Because you don't really have a lot of room at the bottom of the page. It's a big book, but you've only got sort of an inch at the bottom of the page.
Yeah. I mean, there's 300 images in it. The captions, I think, about 150 words each. So actually, there's 75,000 words in the book, which is a whole book's worth of words, but it's broken down because it's mission by mission. There's an introduction to each mission as an overview of it, and then this is what happened from launch to splashdown. So it is quite difficult. So I start with the imagery. I do an initial, assess every single piece of film that was captured on a mission. 16mm film, what type of film will suit the stacking process, or what's interesting that we can see in it, and then all of the still images. And I'll look for anything that's clearly going to be visually stunning or show something interesting. The astronaut, the inside of the spacecraft, rendezvous, something technical or a historical moment. And then I also look at things like the Ed Whiteworth and there might be something interesting in that. Let's do a quick edit. Yes, there is. Right, I'm going to come back to that. So I end up with a set of imagery. Then I just completely consume myself in that mission. I read every word that was said on the mission, like I say, with these mission transcripts, which are time-stamped, which is very useful. The astronaut memoirs, the oral histories, the mission reports. I look at the flight plans and the orbital charts to then produce a time frame of the mission. What story needs to be told from launch to splashdown, and then I map the imagery to that. Any pertinent quotes as the photographs were taken. Like I say, to help tell that story. Now, I may then say, well, something really important here happened, but I've not got an image. So I'll go back to the imagery and pick the best one. So occasionally go through the book and say, well, that's not a great image, but it's there for a reason. It's there because it was important. In fact, there's a page that's black, that's completely blank. There's no photograph because Michael Collins lost his Hasselblad. But what happened on the EVA was absolutely incredible. I can't not tell that story. So there's actually a black page and a really long caption to tell the story. So it's mapping that on a timeline so we can see the imageries and follow along and read and like I say, tell these incredible, the human drama that unfolded, particularly on Gemini, is just because of this risk. 10 missions in 20 months, really fast paced, trying to catch up with the Soviets, constantly pushing the boundaries. And like I say, reading the transcripts in particular, just really hits home just the level of risk they were taking. But to know when a photograph was taken isn't that straightforward, because although you can look at the number within a film magazine, occasionally they're not numbered correctly. Occasionally they're numbered backwards. You might take a few on this magazine. They took multiple cameras, multiple magazines. They took some on that one, then some on that one, and then went back to that one. The 16mm film is obviously silent, and there's no reference at all for when that is. So to try and map those to the time frames quite difficult. So we'll look at all kinds of clues that is in the imagery. Things like on Mercury, like I say, we've got this pilot observer camera. When in the mission is this? So I'd look at, for example, if I want to know when booster engine cutoff is, frame by frame, you can just see as they move slightly at booster engine cutoff. When have they entered space and the straps start to float? With the mirror, I can see the instrument console, and reading the transcripts, for example, John Glenn will say, okay, capsule separation is green. And I can see capsule separation light come on. So I know, right, that exact moment is capsule separation. And then he'll say, okay, and I can see the booster. So, oh, can we see the booster? And so I can look, and in the reflection of his visor through the window, we can see the booster. So, right, there's I know that is capsule separation. So I have all these points where I know that's roughly where we are in the mission. On the longer Gemini missions, for example, when this goes out, I think it should still be the 60th anniversary of Gemini 7. Mm-hmm. So Gemini 7 was in space for 2 weeks. So they were filming for 2 weeks. So particularly the 16mm film, what I'd use there is occasionally they'd just capture the moon. Well, I could work out on launch day what phase of the moon was it, how many days old was the moon. And in this piece of imagery, I can see and estimate how many days old the moon is in that one. And I know, all right, that's 7 days late, this is the date. So all those kind of visual clues and all of the mission transcripts that are timestamped helped create this map that I can then apply the images to tell the stories.
You'd think they'd have been a little bit more on point with their photograph and their log record on 7, because they had nothing else to do.
That's true. Yeah. That's the point, though, is the Apollo, for example, the historical record's pretty good. There is still, I remember doing the book, there were still things missing and there were some errors. But for the further back you go in time, Mercury and Gemini, the historical record isn't as good. It's very patchy. So it just took a lot more, effort to work a lot of this stuff out. And you mentioned the logs. Again, reading the transcripts, you can hear them occasionally saying, "Are you writing these down?" "Oh, no, I haven't been doing because, X, Y, Z." And when you understand what's going on in the mission, you think, I can understand why you weren't logging every single photograph when, the fuel cells are failing, for example.
Yes. You've mentioned the stacking process a few times. I found that fascinating. So that, am I right in thinking from reading your description of the book, that's taking, say, a quarter, an eighth of a second worth of film and using those very similar images to build up more detail on top of them? How many frames would you be using to sort of bring that single image alive?
Anything from, there's a huge benefit even using a few frames, but when you use hundreds, there's one in the book of Richard Gordon when he's riding like a cowboy, as Pete Conrad pointed out, on his EVA. There's 1,000 in that. The more, the better. Once you hit about 200 or 300, you hit kind of a sweet spot, really. But even a few frames. So the concept is,
so I've completely misunderstood. That's not sequential. That's the same frame on top of each other then?
No, it is sequential.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
But I think what you're getting at is if there's 1,000 frames, that's a long time frame and therefore surely things move. So, and that was, so I had to develop a new technique when I did the Apollo project. So when I did that image of Armstrong, he stood still long enough for me to lift enough frames to have this transformation. Because he was getting the contingency sample prepared, he had his gold visor up, he stayed still as he was doing that. The camera was locked off in the window, so the camera didn't move. Perfect. Easy to align and stack over whatever it was, a second or two. The later Apollo missions, and the case through Gemini, is a lot of this footage was filmed handheld. So there's an astronaut floating in 0G. They're filming someone else that's floating in 0G. So there's a lot of movement. So to align the frames you can't do that using a normal technique. So I developed my own technique to still to be able to stack, but take account of all this movement. It's a all like of a process, really labor intensive, really frustrating. But again, when you know what you're going to get at the end, this, be able to climb on board these spacecraft and see these missions as never before, that's the reward. And so I always know when it's going to be, worth the effort. So the concept of stacking it's used in astrophotography, is perhaps the way most people might know of it, but most people don't really know what it is, and it's hard to explain. But if you think of it in an analog world, so let's call it cinefilm camera. So it's movie footage. Let's say it's 12 frames a second. If you then take those 12 frames and if you were to cut them with a pair of scissors, the actual film, and if the image doesn't move too much and you stack them on top of each other and squish them together and look through them, you can probably imagine that signal, which is the image, gets stronger. But crucially, the noise doesn't, because the noise is in a random place on every frame. Noise is completely random. So you improve the signal, but the noise stays the same. You improve the signal to noise ratio, so you improve the image. The improvement's equivalent to the square root of the number of frames. So only 9 frames, of course, you have 3 times the improvement. So you can quite quickly get that level of improvement. And 9 frames is usually a short time frame, and so it's easy to stack. But like I say, I wanted to use potentially hundreds of frames. So that's where I then had to use this new technique to take account of all that movement.
Because doing these videos, I've sometimes had to layer up various levels to take flicker out of lights and things like that from the digital filming. And that's 1-2 frames. Any more than that, and you start sort of seeing the artifacting through each of them. So that must have been incredibly rewarding getting it right, but then incredibly frustrating finding that sweet spot of many, many, many images just to get the one that you needed.
It's both. You're right. It's frustrating and it's rewarding. And there are moments where you just wish if the camera just moved slightly more, or if someone had stayed a little bit still, just slightly longer, it would have produced an even more incredible image. But you can't go back and, of course, undo history. We're lucky that they took so much film. You know, the first time we humans left Earth, we took cameras and it was documented. But this was another general frustration of mine is we see the same images over and over again and not many of them. And when we see them, they're not of great quality. Apollo took 35,000 photographs. Gemini and Mercury took 5,000 photographs. There's hours of 16mm film. So the opportunity to go back and like improve the quality, but also to enable people to see more of it was something I couldn't pass up.
So let's ask a difficult question here, really, because I can hear the evil Mr. Gammon commenter saying you're manipulating these images if you're stacking seconds worth of films to get a still. From what you've described, it's capturing the data within that sequence to create an image. So it's essentially not, photoshopping something, but it's actually just taking the pure data that's there and just sort of harmonizing it across a certain strip of film.
It's just that it is all raw data. It is all the light that landed on that film that's captured. No pixels were harmed during the making of this book, and I don't insert pixels. So another key point is this is historically important footage. It needs to be done respectfully and it needs to be accurate. So, for example, with Apollo, I had some of those Apollo astronauts actually involved in helping critique and because when you push digital processing, you can push it too hard. And when I first started to do it, I just thought, oh my God, these look absolutely incredible. And I thought, am I pushing the processing too hard? But actually, when you learn about the visual in space, it is very unique. It is very stark. You get the most incredible black levels. As Charlie Duke said, it's a black we can't comprehend on Earth. It's almost like it's got a texture. And then you've got this incredibly bright, either lunar surface or colourful Earth. So you have a huge dynamic range. Because there's no atmosphere, there's no atmospheric haze, there's no particles. It's incredibly crystal clear, whether you're here or in the distance. So you do get this really stark look that's actually important to get right the imagery. So creating an accurate record is really important. That's also the reason I don't use AI. There's no AI processing used in any of these images. For me, if you apply AI processing to a photograph, you can't call it a photograph anymore because we don't know what has... a photograph is capturing the light on a sensor if it's digital or on film. If you put that through some software and, like I say, pixels are inserted and we don't know what's happened and assumptions have been made, what are we actually looking at? The photograph, it just loses all its provenance. So you could perhaps call it a piece of art, you could call it a representation, but for me, it's no longer a photograph. So it was important not to use AI for that reason. The stacking technique, as you say, each individual frame, that light was captured. It's simply a case of bringing a couple of seconds worth into one to effectively freeze it. So my objective is never to embellish or reinvent. It's about bringing clarity, to simply, peel back the layers of aging and degradation and noise to reveal what was always inherent in that film, as clearly as we've been able to see before, but also faithfully.
You mentioned that you got to work with and show some of the Apollo guys the images. What was their reaction to it? As I didn't get to chat to you about the Apollo, but let's pin both of them out. It's Christmas after all.
Yeah, I mean that's the most rewarding thing for me is to hear their feedback, or the astronauts' children, Ed White's children, for example. With the Apollo book, Charlie Duke, said this is. It's like made it come alive to me again after over 50 years. He actually got quite emotional when he talked about, I did an event with him, it's about 18 months ago, when he talked about when he first saw it, because it made it come alive to him. He said it's closest to actually being there. So that was the ultimate, that's the ultimate feedback. But yeah, a lot of the astronauts, I mean, thinking of Gemini, Jim Lovell, thankfully got a copy to him before the Gemini book both before he passed. So he gave that wonderful quote on the back of the Gemini book, and he's just said what he wants it to do is share the awe and the wonder that he experienced when he looked out of those windows on these earliest missions, and to remind us all of the beauty of our home planet. So if the book can go any way to doing that, that would be amazing. But yeah, to get that feedback from a lot of the Apollo astronauts, and Dave Scott's been helpful, Gene Kranz was helpful during the book. That's really the ultimate reward for me.
Okay, Sophie's choice question. Which has been, of the results, which has been your favourite so far, and why is it the Ed White photo?
And why is it the Ed White photo? I like different images for different reasons. So with Gemini, the photographs of Earth are just absolute. I mean, they took not just some of the first, but some of the finest photographs of Earth ever captured on film, partly because of the altitude they flew to. The Gemini 11, for example, they held the Earth altitude orbit record for 58 years until only last year. The Polaris Dawn mission broke it just. So that's part of the reason that the photographs of Earth from Gemini are particularly stunning and great equipment. The way that film and these cameras captured that era. You know, we see this retro yet kind of still futuristic spacesuits and spacecraft against that backdrop of Earth, and the way film captures it. It's just an intoxicating visual aesthetic. It's something that's clearly referencing modern sci-fi movies. So those shots of Earth are wonderful, but it's really the ones that capture the human side that I've always liked the most and been drawn to the most. That's something I want to do. Like I say, with the stacking process, we can climb on board the spacecraft and ride along with them. We can see anticipation at launch. We can see their exhaustion after spacewalk. We can see the awe and wonder as they look out the windows. Trepidation during re-entry. So in terms of one of my favourite images from the book is one of John Glenn. Just been told his heat shield may well have come loose before re-entry. If true, he would likely burn up in the atmosphere. So again, in researching the film, I've worked out exactly when that moment is, stacked that film, and there's this slight orange glow you can see as he's 3,000 degree Fahrenheit heat inches from his back, not knowing if he's about to burn up in the atmosphere. And that's just a portrait of courage and a reminder of what these guys were doing back in the early 60s. And then, yes, photographs such as the one on the cover of Ed White, because it's got a bit of everything. It's an image we've almost never seen before, or perhaps, or very rarely. It was a big transformation. It's almost artistically amazing. Aesthetically, it's got that vibe. It's got the historical side. He's just got back in from this spacewalk. It's poignant. So yeah, those that show the human side tend to be my favourites.
I can remember when you shared that image when you announced the book. Very, very rarely these days does a photograph that you see on social media make you stop. And I remember that one, probably because I find Ed's story fascinating as it is, but my goodness, what a shot. And from something that was just a sort of a bleeding light through the capsule. Yeah, it's incredible. So I'm just here to say thank you for that. All the other ones are great, but I bought the book because that one was. I would have bought the book anyways. As this is my favorite of NASA's. What has been NASA's feedback from the two books?
Yeah, I mean, the point to make is they weren't kind of sponsored by NASA, if you like. They do like what I've done. They've been very supportive. Of course, this celebrates their past. It gets people excited about the future. So, of course, we're going to return to the moon in the next few months on Artemis 2. So it gets people excited about that. So they've been very supportive and they like what I've done, but it wasn't kind of sponsored in any way by NASA. But like I say, that feedback from those that were there is kind of the ultimate for me.
Yes, Artemis 2, Canadian around the moon. That's what we want. My countryman, Jeremy, finally.
Oh, very good.
Yes, finally.
Jeremy, yeah.
And apparently he's absolutely lovely, according to Jennifer Levisser. So,
yeah, I was fortunate enough to spend a little bit of time with the crew, and they've got lots of copies of Apollo Remastered around the astronaut office for a bit of inspiration. But I'm sure either way, I know they are focused on how important the imagery is, and I know they will capture incredible photographs. We're going to see the equivalent of an Earthrise or a Blue Marble. They will capture, images that will live forever. I mean, this is a quote on the last page of the Apollo book from Richard Underwood, who's the chief of photography, who reiterated to the astronauts, look, when you get back, you're going to be a national hero, but the photographs, if you get great photographs, they'll live forever. And, no question, that's correct.
Andy, thank you so much for taking the time. What's the name of the book?
Gemini and Mercury Remastered.
And the name of the other book?
Apollo Remastered.
Links are in the description, everybody. I cannot recommend both of them highly enough. At the moment, they live down here, which is not good, but they've been within arm's reach as I've been getting the questions.
They're rather heavy as well.
They're great. Yeah, when we say coffee table, you need a proper coffee table. For these ones. Thank you so much. Look forward to whatever you do next. And the exhibition, that's coming up soon as well, isn't it? We should mention that.
So the photographic exhibition of Gemini and Mercury Remastered is still on at Jodrell Bank in Cheshire until I think it's the 4th of January. It then moves to the Royal Albert Hall in London on the 16th of January to the 16th of March. It may then go on a tour. There's the Moonwalker show that I worked on that showcases the Apollo Remastered imagery on a huge scale. So this is the Tom Hanks narrated show. That's back on now in London. It's also on at Johnson Space Centre in Houston. It's in Manchester from next week for a month, and in Amsterdam, I think, from next week too. So there's lots to see.
Cheshire, Manchester, sounds like it's just keeping you around your house.
It's quite handy, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andy.
Thanks for having me on.
I cannot thank Andy Saunders enough, and I cannot recommend Gemini and Mercury Remastered, along with Apollo Remastered, highly enough. They are incredible works of art, and just seeing some of those images pop off the page as they do is worth every penny of the books. And of course, you can get those books via the links in our description below, along with all the links to Andy's website, apolloremastered.com, and all of the events that are coming up. So we've got the events at the Royal Albert Hall, the ones at Jodrell Bank, Moonwalkers. His images are incredible, and to see them on those massive screens, I'm going to get out to see Moonwalker pretty soon. So please do check out all the links in the description below. Be sure to give Andy a follow on all the social medias because he's great at sharing some of the behind the scenes elements of his work, and we can't wait to see what he does next. Of course, we've spoken to Jeffrey Kluger as well. 2 episodes out in this anniversary week of Gemini 7. So do check out our video with him where we talk about Jim Lovell, all the amazing stuff that happened during Gemini in relation to his new book, Gemini, Stepping Stone to the Moon, which I thoroughly enjoyed too. So please like and subscribe, leave some comments. Let me know what you think of these ones in the comments below. It's not often we do 2 episodes back to back like this, but it's really exciting, and these 2 dovetail together well. And it's the time of year you may be wanting to buy books for people. So links in the description below to all of them. And thank you. If you've joined us on Patreon, you get these episodes early, but hitting the like, subscribe button, leaving us a comment helps our AI overlords to, amplify this out there. So until next time, thank you so much. Do check out the Pima Air and Space Museum website. All the links are in the description below. They've got a fantastic space section. So it's not just airplanes out there in the desert. So until next time, please do check in with your friends, make sure everybody's doing okay, and take care of yourself. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye-bye. I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun from just £3 a month, plus a bit of VAT, get your name in these very credits, and get all the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished. The Aviation Show is hosted and produced by Matt Bone and is a Boney Abroad production.